The stage was set in a packed auditorium, the kind of venue designed for political history. Red, white, and blue banners hung overhead, while the roar of the crowd reverberated through the walls. On one side of the stage stood Donald Trump, shoulders squared, radiating the kind of confidence that had made his rallies infamous. On the other stood Mike Pence, his posture rigid, eyes sharp, and voice steady, as if he had finally decided to break away from the shadow of his former running mate. The moderator's voice echoed, "Tonight, the Republican Party faces a critical question about its future. President Trump, Vice President Pence, the floor is yours." Pence leaned forward, gripping the podium tightly. For years, he had stood quietly behind Trump, rarely challenging him in public. But tonight, his words came with steel. "Donald," Pence began, his voice crisp, "America doesn't just need volume. It needs vision. It needs a leader who can bring people together, not tear them apart for applause lines. Leadership is not about chaos. It's about character." The audience erupted, some cheering, others booing. Pence's supporters stood and clapped, sensing he had finally drawn a line. Trump didn't move. He let the noise swell, then raised a hand. Instantly, the room hushed. His gaze locked on Pence, a half-smirk curling across his lips. "Character, Mike?" Trump said, his voice low but cutting. "If it weren't for me, nobody in this room would even remember your name. You were in my shadow because that's the only place you could survive. And now you stand here pretending you're the savior of the Republican Party?" Gasps swept through the audience. Pence's jaw tightened, but Trump wasn't done. He leaned into the microphone, his voice booming now, "You call me chaos, but chaos is what exposed the corruption. You call me division, but division is what happens when weak men like you can't stand up to the fight. And tonight, you'll learn the difference between making speeches and making history." The crowd erupted again, this time louder, chanting, "Trump! Trump! Trump!" Pence clenched his jaw, bracing himself for the storm he had unleashed. The audience's roar still echoed when Pence steadied himself, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted his microphone. He wasn't going to let Trump's words swallow him whole. He leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with defiance. "Donald, you can attack me all you want, but the truth is bigger than either of us. The Republican Party has to choose, are we about governing, or are we about grievance? Are we about leading the American people, or are we about reliving the past?" Some in the crowd cheered, eager for Pence's measured tone. Others booed, clearly unmoved. Trump tilted his head slightly, as if amused that Pence was trying to climb the same mountain he had built. Pence pressed harder. "You call me weak because I refused to break the Constitution on January 6th. But strength isn't about shouting the loudest or demanding loyalty at any cost. Real strength is honoring the law even when it costs you politically. That's the truth voters need to hear." The words landed heavily. The room grew tense, every eye fixed on Trump, waiting for the counterpunch. Trump's smirk vanished. He leaned into the microphone, his voice suddenly sharp and commanding. "Mike, you don't get to lecture me about the Constitution. I fought for this country when the swamp tried to rig everything against us. You talk about law. The law was twisted, bent, and broken, and you stood there, silent, when the American people begged for courage. You didn't defend the Constitution. You hid behind it to protect yourself." The crowd erupted, half in applause, half in outrage. Trump raised his voice over the noise. "And let's be honest, Mike, nobody voted for you. They voted for me. You rode my wave, you took my stage, and now you pretend you can lead it without me. That's not loyalty. That's delusion." Gasps and shouts filled the room. Pence gripped the podium tighter, his lips pressed into a thin line. Trump had turned the tables again, framing Pence not as a principled man, but as an ingrate. The crowd sensed it, and the tension only grew. The tension in the hall was electric, the crowd split down the middle like a fault line ready to erupt. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras zoomed in, and both men stood in the spotlight, one fueled by defiance, the other by dominance. Pence adjusted his tie and looked straight into the cameras, speaking not just to the audience in the room but to millions watching at home. "Donald, history will not remember the loudest man in the room. It will remember the one who stood on principle. I may not have your rallies or your chants, but I have something you can't buy with applause: integrity." His words landed with a hush, a moment of stillness that seemed to cut through the noise. A portion of the crowd applauded, but the cheers were drowned out almost instantly by chants of "Trump! Trump! Trump!" The former president raised his hand and let the sound fill the hall before responding. "Integrity?" Trump's voice rang out, dripping with sarcasm. "Mike, if you had integrity, you would have stood with the millions of Americans who trusted us. Instead, when the moment came, you folded. You didn't defend the people, you defended the very system that betrayed them." The crowd erupted again, some jeering Pence, others roaring in approval of Trump. Pence's face tightened, but Trump stepped forward, his voice growing louder, sharper, like a blade. "You talk about history? History will remember who fought, and who hid. Who stood up when the country was under siege, and who ran behind the shield of principle." He pointed at Pence, his finger jabbing through the air. "And tonight, history sees the truth: without me, you are nothing but a footnote." The roar from Trump's supporters shook the hall, drowning out any rebuttal Pence could muster. Even those who had cheered for Pence now looked uncertain. His words about principle sounded noble, but Trump's fire made them feel hollow. Pence took a deep breath, gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles whitened. He wasn't finished, but the balance of the room had already shifted. Trump owned the stage. The moderator, sensing the intensity, tried to steer the debate back to policy, but the stage had already transformed into a battleground of egos. The crowd wasn't interested in statistics or bullet points, they were there for the clash of two Republican titans. Pence, refusing to be silenced, leaned into the microphone. "Donald, you think loyalty means agreeing with you at every turn. But true loyalty is to the Constitution, to God, and to the American people. I didn't betray you, I stood for the law when you asked me to break it." The room murmured, some nodding, others shaking their heads. Pence's words had weight, but Trump's eyes flashed with fire. He raised a hand, silencing the noise, and then unleashed his counter. "You keep hiding behind the Constitution, Mike, but here's the truth: the people voted for me because they knew I would fight. And when the fight came, you disappeared. You weren't a shield for the people, you were a shield for the swamp." The crowd roared. Supporters stood to their feet, waving signs and chanting. Pence tried to interject, but Trump cut him off, his voice booming with unmistakable dominance. "And let me tell you something else. Loyalty is not about God or the Constitution, loyalty is about standing with the people who put us here. You don't get to claim virtue when the very people you abandoned are the ones who built this movement." The hall exploded in applause, drowning Pence out entirely. He tightened his grip on the podium, his face pale under the lights. He had tried to position himself as the man of principle, but Trump had reframed the narrative in an instant. Pence wasn't principled, he was weak. The cameras caught the moment, the split screen showing Trump leaning forward like a lion ready to pounce and Pence stiff, defensive, struggling to keep his ground. The battle wasn't over, but the scoreboard of public opinion was shifting, and Trump was ahead. The spotlight shifted back to Pence. He inhaled slowly, as if summoning every ounce of resolve left in him. He had been vice president, he had stood beside Trump for 4 turbulent years, and now he was determined to show the crowd he wasn't just an afterthought. "Donald," Pence began, his voice firmer this time, "you talk about loyalty to the people, but loyalty also means telling them the truth, even when it's hard. America needs a leader who respects the rule of law and who can unite this nation. That's something you never even tried to do." The words drew gasps. Some in the audience clapped hesitantly, as if unsure whether it was safe to support him. Pence pressed on, his tone sharpening. You thrive on division because it keeps you in the spotlight. But division tears families apart, divides churches, and weakens the very country we swore to serve. That's not leadership, that's ego. For a brief moment, it felt like Pence had landed a real hit. Even Trump's supporters quieted, waiting to see how he would respond. Trump straightened his jacket, leaned on the podium with both hands, and smiled, the kind of smile that usually meant he was about to deliver a blow no one would forget. Mike, you sound like a preacher at Sunday service, Trump said, drawing laughter from sections of the audience. You talk about unity, but you couldn't unite a room of 10 people without me standing next to you. You had your chance to lead, and America didn't even notice you were there. The crowd roared with laughter and cheers, the sound pounding against the walls. Trump didn't let it fade before delivering the dagger. You say I didn't try to unite this nation. Wrong. I united millions of hardworking Americans who were tired of politicians like you, bland, boring, and afraid of taking risks. They don't want another sermon, Mike. They want a fighter. And tonight, they can see clearly who the fighter is. Pence's face stiffened, his attempt at a moral high ground swallowed by Trump's fire. Cameras zoomed in, one man looked defiant but diminished, the other commanding and unstoppable. The laughter from Trump's last blow still echoed when Pence lifted his chin, refusing to retreat. His voice cut through the cheers with a sharper edge now. Donald, this isn't about fighters or preachers. This is about the presidency of the United States. You think leadership is about mocking people, about calling names and belittling anyone who disagrees with you. But Americans deserve better. They deserve dignity in their White House. The hall quieted slightly, intrigued. Pence leaned forward, his voice rising with conviction. Dignity isn't boring. Respect isn't weakness. And chaos is not courage. History will not reward tantrums. It will reward steady hands. Some in the audience clapped loudly, giving Pence a moment of momentum. But Trump was already moving, already preparing the counterpunch. He stood straighter, his eyes glinting under the lights. Dignity? Trump repeated, his tone mocking but sharp. Mike, you had dignity when you stood behind me, when you nodded along, when you followed my lead. You had dignity because you borrowed mine. Without me, your speeches don't move crowds, they put them to sleep. The crowd laughed again, some whistling and chanting his name. Trump didn't stop there. He pointed toward Pence, his hands steady. You talk about steady hands? Those steady hands signed off on the very betrayal that millions of Americans will never forget. You didn't protect this country, you protected the establishment. That's not steady, Mike. That's weak. And weakness never wins. The words cut deep. Pence's supporters tried to shout back, but the roar of Trump's crowd swallowed them whole. The cameras caught it perfectly, Trump standing tall, commanding the stage, while Pence looked cornered, as if his arguments were slipping through his fingers. The balance of the debate was clear. Pence had come to challenge Trump. Instead, he was being dismantled piece by piece in front of the nation. Pence's jaw tightened, but his eyes burned with determination. He wasn't finished. Donald, he said, his voice steady but louder now, the presidency isn't a reality show. It isn't about applause lines or clever insults. It's about service. It's about putting the country first, not yourself. The audience reacted with mixed emotions. Some applauded fiercely, while others booed so loudly the moderators had to raise their hands for calm. Pence pressed on, sensing that for once, his words had pierced the noise. I served this nation faithfully for 4 years, Pence continued. I defended you when you were under attack, I carried your message across the country. But leadership is not about demanding loyalty at every turn. Leadership is about accountability. And when January 6th came, I chose the Constitution because I swore an oath not to you, Donald, but to the people and to God. The crowd gasped at the sharpness of his tone. It was Pence at his boldest, perhaps the boldest he had ever been. The silence that followed was thick, all eyes snapping back to Trump. Trump's face hardened. He didn't smile this time, didn't smirk. He leaned into the microphone, his voice deep and unyielding. "Mike, don't you dare lecture me on loyalty and service. Nobody in this room believes you carried me. I carried you. I carried the entire party. Without me, you're a forgotten politician from Indiana. And when the fight came, you didn't choose the people, you chose the swamp." The audience erupted, roaring with approval. Trump stepped forward, his hand slicing through the air like a gavel. "And let's get something straight. The presidency isn't a Sunday sermon, it's a battlefield. And on a battlefield, weak men don't last. You didn't choose the Constitution, Mike. You chose the easy way out. And America will never forgive that." The chant of "Trump! Trump! Trump!" shook the walls. Pence had swung hard, but Trump had struck back harder, turning Pence's proudest defense into a damning weakness. The room buzzed with chants, but Pence steadied himself, his voice cutting through the chaos with sharp resolve. "Donald, you can mock me all you want, but I'm not afraid of your words. This isn't about me. It's about the future of the Republican Party. Are we going to be a party of law and order, or a party that worships one man's ego?" The audience reacted instantly, half applauding, half booing, the sound clashing like thunder. Pence pushed forward, his face flushed but determined. The presidency is not a stage for grudges. It's not about who can shout the loudest. It's about vision, about values, about being worthy of the office. That's something America has to decide, and they won't be bullied into it. For a moment, Pence stood tall, conviction radiating from him. But Trump, unshaken, leaned back toward his microphone with a calm smirk. He waited until the noise ebbed before speaking. "Vision? Mike, the only vision you ever had was standing behind me in photos." The crowd laughed, some even chanting again. Trump's voice grew sharper. "You talk about law and order, but let me tell you, the people don't want more lectures, they want action. They want results. And the only reason they ever heard your name was because of me." The words landed like a hammer. Trump stepped forward, his tone gaining fire. "You think you're the future of this party? The truth is, Mike, you already had your chance. And when the moment came, you showed the country you weren't strong enough. That's why you'll never be president. Because America doesn't follow weakness. America follows strength." The hall erupted again, this time louder than before. Pence tried to smile faintly, but the cameras captured the tension in his jaw, the weight of Trump's words hanging in the air. The narrative was slipping further out of Pence's hands. Trump wasn't just countering him, he was defining him, right there in front of the nation. The atmosphere in the hall had become combustible. Every exchange between the two men was sharper than the last, each word landing like a punch in the middle of a roaring crowd. Pence, his face flushed but resolute, leaned into the mic one more time. "Donald, strength isn't about shouting the loudest or tearing people down. Real strength is leading with humility, with faith, with respect for the office of the presidency. The American people don't need a fighter who divides them, they need a leader who lifts them up." The crowd split, some applauding, others booing. Pence held his ground, his hand gripping the podium as though anchoring himself to his convictions. Trump, however, didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice thundering across the room. "Mike, let's get real. Nobody ever looked at you and thought, that's the man to lead America. They looked at you because you stood next to me. And when your moment came, when America needed courage, you didn't lift people up, you let them down." The crowd roared in approval, the Trump chant starting again. Trump didn't stop. His voice cut deeper, sharper. "You talk about humility and faith. That's fine for Sunday service, Mike. But in the Oval Office, when the world is watching, when enemies are circling, America doesn't need a sermon. It needs a warrior. And you, Mike, you're no warrior. The audience erupted, cheers shaking the walls. Pence opened his mouth to respond, but the cameras captured it all, his hesitation, his struggle to push back against Trump's relentless fire. Trump smirked, sensing the moment. He raised his hand and let the crowd roar wash over him. America doesn't follow weakness. America doesn't follow hesitation. America follows strength. And tonight, everyone here can see exactly where the strength is. The chant of USA, USA, thundered through the hall. Pence stood there, rigid and cornered, while Trump basked in the roar of a crowd that clearly saw him as the victor. The hall thundered with chants of USA, USA, as Trump lifted his hand, commanding the energy of the crowd like a conductor before an orchestra. Pence stood stiffly, his knuckles white on the podium, waiting for the noise to fade so he could deliver one final stand. He leaned into the mic, his voice steady but weary. History will remember more than who shouted louder. It will remember who stood for the truth when it mattered most. Donald, someday the crowds will be gone, and the cameras will be off. And when that day comes, the question will be simple: did you fight for yourself, or did you fight for America? The words carried weight, a final attempt to seize the high ground. The audience gave a respectful murmur, some applauding, others shaking their heads. Trump's response was instant, his voice booming like thunder. Mike, you want to talk about history? History already remembers. It remembers strength. It remembers courage. And it remembers who stood in the fight when America needed a champion. Spoiler alert, it wasn't you. The crowd roared again, stomping, cheering, the air vibrating with raw energy. Trump raised his hand, and the noise swelled even louder. You say I fight for myself. Wrong. I fight for the forgotten men and women of this country, the truck drivers, the farmers, the soldiers, the families struggling to survive under a broken system. They are America. And tonight, they can see with their own eyes that I'm still fighting for them. The applause became deafening, the cameras zooming in on Trump's confident expression and Pence's pale, drawn face. In that instant, the narrative was sealed. Pence had tried to challenge Trump, to outmaneuver him with principle and dignity. But Trump had turned the stage into his arena, crushing his opponent with the sheer force of his presence. As the chants of Trump, Trump, Trump shook the hall, Pence's figure seemed smaller, almost swallowed by the moment. The headlines were already writing themselves. When Pence challenged Trump, he paid the price.